All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the lunch and the chance to spend a little time connecting with different folks. It's my pleasure to welcome Ralph Hefner from the University of Rochester. As you can tell by the structure of the symposium, we're slowly inching our way closer and closer maybe to behavior. It will come as no surprise to many of you that the path to completing that bridge that metaphorically was cast out earlier today, the path to completing it is probably going to involve some pretty serious theoretical and computational work. And Ralph has really made his career in building exactly those kinds of models that link the sorts of generative and integrative processes that are happening in vision in order to reach some kind of behavioral decision. So please join me in welcoming Ralph to talk about signatures of hierarchical inference in the brain.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the organizers, to the organizers for inviting me. It's an amazing symposium. The good news is there are no equations in my talk, but there are plenty in the papers if you're interested in following up or want to ask me. The bad news is I'm going to take you back to 20th century science after listening to 21st century science, especially in this last talk. That was quite amazing. Okay, but first we go back to the 19th century. Helmholtz and Mach, two 19th century physicists, basically described perception as inference. They weren't the first, as John pointed out this morning, but they had a big influence on the thinking of many people. And what they realized is that the sensory input that we receive at any moment in time is inadequate to give rise to this rich perceptual experience that we seem to have. A classic example is the fact that our visual inputs are two-dimensional on the retina, but our perception of the world is three-dimensional. And so that's an inverse problem that infinitely many three-dimensional objects are compatible with any one two-dimensional projection. And what the brain seems to be making us do is perceive the most probable course for the image on the eye. And how the brain does that is one of the big I think central questions of systems neuroscience. I personally find this view of looking at vision and visual processing particularly compelling, also partly because in a previous life, I actually used to be astrophysicist. My PhD was on building a dynamical model of the inner galaxy, and when you hear galaxy and Milky Way, you might think of think of an image like this. Here's the galactic bulge rotating, spiral arms, the sun is somewhere here. But the important thing about this picture, which is why I'm showing it, is that none of us has ever seen this, right? This only lives in our imagination. What we actually get to see is this splotchy band of light on the sky when we see it. That's called the Milky Way, and only by combining it with prior information about what galaxies look like elsewhere in the universe, that we can look at it from different perspectives, and combining it with our knowledge of the equations of motion and physics in general, can we construct the most probable explanation for our observations, and imagine what it would look like if we could leave the galactic disk and look at the galaxy head-on. So how does the brain solve the equivalent problem in the context of perceptual inference? How does it solve this inverse problem? And one cue to answer this question, I think, comes from anatomy. You have a famous wiring diagram by Philemon von Essen of the visual systems, the visual cortical areas in the macaque brain, the retina down here, LGN, and then the primary visual cortex, and then secondary and higher level areas. And the two key insights, I think, relevant for this talk from this work was that these visual areas, they, at least to some degree, appear to be organized hierarchically. It's not an all-to-all connectivity, number one. Number two is any two areas that are connected in one direction also tend to be connected in the other direction. So if you look at this, if you simplify this enough from a theoretician's perspective, you end up with an information flow that looks something like this. Here's the retina, feed-forward information flow from the retina to primary visual cortex, and then bidirectional information flow between cortical areas, and of course, recurrent connectivity within each area. And this kind of information flow is exactly what you would expect if the brain, or if you hypothesize that the brain is performing hierarchical probabilistic inference in a hierarchical, generative model of the inputs. And this insight goes back to Mumford in the 90s, and then was explicated in a nice long paper by Lee Mumford 2003, and has inspired many people. Before running with it, I think it's worth taking a step back and contrasting it with what I would say is still the main view guiding most of visual neuroscience, namely that of feed-forward processing, where all the information is on the retina and is transformed from this pixel basis in which the input appears or is formatted in the successive stages to transform it into something that makes behaviorally relevant causes explicit at the top level and easily decodable or usable for guiding our decisions and actions. And now we know the brain is close to optimal in many perceptual or sensory motor tasks, and so we might want to interpret this probabilistically, and we might call this discriminative inference. In fact, that's what we did in a recent review paper with several of the speakers here. And this view, generative inference. And discriminative inference is kind of defined by the fact that the posterior over the latent variable is only defined at the top level. And the function of these hierarchical computations that happen between the retina and this top level is really primarily as a function approximator of this really complicated mapping from this pixel representation on the retina to the identity of objects, faces, even appearance, etc. And so in contrast, what we call generative inference is defined by the idea that these posteriors are represented at every level, not just at the top level, like in P of Z given E, at all of these levels. And now, where these would be V1, MT, V2, V4, etc. And so the critical question to distinguish between those two models is the role of feedback connections, right? So in the generative inference perspective, the primary role, or one of the primary roles of feedback signals, is to communicate priors and prior beliefs, expectations about these lower-level causes given the higher levels. This is, of course, not the only hypothesis for feedback connections. I would say the dominant hypotheses are those of attention and learning, like most neurophysiology papers when they find evidence for top-down effects interpreted through the lens of attention, somehow tuning these lower-level sensory representations to make them more relevant for the task or more informative for the task. And so, distinguishing between those, hypotheses has been one of the key goals of the work in my lab. And we've done that because we, want to do everything mathematically and rigorous and et cetera in the context of a really, well-constrained artificial context, namely two-choice tasks, which have been the workforce of for many studies, right, over the last 100 years. In particular, two-choice evidence accumulation tasks. And what task it is, what sensory modality, etc., doesn't really matter, but, you could think of a moving dot task, or like an orientation discrimination task, or whatever your favorite task, or pause on click task in the auditory domain, whatever your favorite task is, this is going to apply to. And so, what we're trying to do in the context of this, of one of these tasks, of that class of tasks, is to manipulate these priors so we can make predictions for their effect on behavior that we can measure, and for neural responses, of course. And so there are really kind of two primary ways in which we do that. One is manipulating the strength of the prior by varying the temporal coherence of the stimulus and by tracking effects over learning. And two, by manipulating the structure of the prior, namely what are the task-relevant inputs, stimuli. And that leads to a set of predictions, both psychophysical and neurophysiological. Most of this is published, but I'm also going to show you some of the more recent results that we've gotten in the neurophysiological domain. Okay, first, manipulating the strength. So let's go back. We have got observations, lower level sensory inferences, higher order inferences. And if we now present multiple stimuli over time, then the classic view would be say, okay, there's a stimulus on the retina, it's somehow represented by some sensory area that leads to some belief over some, abstract variable at some higher level in the brain. And if these arrive over time, then this system primarily runs in the feed-forward fashion. Now, if we present these in the context of an evidence accumulation task, this higher level, or at least one of these higher level variables, is going to be a task category or choice to be made, and the monkey or the observer has to form a belief over what the optimal choice would be, and has to accumulate evidence from these subsequent frames of evidence of stimuli into a overall belief or what the most likely correct task category is. Okay, and that's typically conceptualized at this top level. And going back to drift diffusion model, lots of influential work by Gold and Shadlin and colleagues. Now, if we take the idea seriously that even that intermediate sensory errors represent beliefs, then even intermediate sensory errors represent posterior beliefs, then they will combine likelihoods that represent the evidence in the outside world and prior expectations. And now, because the world is predictable, because early frames in many of these tasks predict later frames, there will be prior expectations that are based on these beliefs about these higher level inferences on influencing the lower level posteriors. Okay, and so now that's the consequence of that is that when the decision-making area is now updating its belief over what's the correct task category, it has to account for this pathway for this influence of the prior belief onto sensor representation. It can't just treat this as new independent evidence, but it has to know that it incorporates some element of its prior and subtract that out or divide that out. It's not a problem for the ideal observer. The ideal observer still performs optimal decisions, but the brain is surely not an ideal observer, but it's performing these computations approximately. And once you perform these approximately, there may be consequences. You may be overcompensating for the influence of this prior or undercompensating for these influences. And that we can measure in the context of an experiment. We can measure that by performing reverse correlation or logistic regression, computing the influence of each piece of stimulus in the outside world onto the final choice. Okay? And so, for instance, here for most of these tasks and all the tasks I'll be talking about today, the optimal weighting is just flat. Every piece of evidence, every piece of stimulus on average has the same information about the final choice. But people have observed all kinds of psychophysical kernels, these are called, or weight profiles, recency effects where later stimuli have a bigger effect, primacy effects where early stimuli have a larger effect on the decision. And with no real good explanation for, unified explanation for, predicting what should you expect in any one experiment for any one task, okay? And I also want to point out that, this feedback is not just controversial in the visual domain. I think you may be misled a little bit by the Symposium speakers today. I think the mainstream view still really is one of feed-forward processing primarily, and when I presented these works first, like 10, 12 years ago, I got a lot of blowback. But there's also been a long debate in the linguistics or language processing literature about to what degree, knowledge about words and semantic knowledge influences our perception of like syllabi and lower level auditory cues. Mostly based on philosophical normative arguments and not really on empirical ones, leading to really strong statements like merge information. Feedback is never necessary. Okay. Luckily, we are empiricists and we can look at what the data tells us. So now, how are we going to manipulate the strength of this prior? So here's a concrete example. Imagine you're in an orientation discrimination task, minus 45 versus plus 45. You could turn this into a evidence accumulation task and make it harder in two primary ways. One is you show a frame with the same orientation, multiple frames, but each frame now you add a lot of noise. So for each frame, it's very uncertain what the orientation of this frame is. But the orientation of all these frames is consistent over time. Okay? This is one way. Another way is that each frame is relatively clear, so there's no uncertainty over what the orientation of that frame is. But now the orientation flips back and forth across frames, and then the task is, okay, were there more frames of, or more orientations of one or the other kind? Okay. Now those two, right? You can make them arbitrarily hard, get to threshold performance, do your classic psychophysics. Now, importantly, they make different predictions in the context of what we're talking about today. So for task A, we expect strong prior signals, right? So depending on your belief that you formed over seeing the first couple of frames, if you think it's going to be a plus 45-degree grading, that is highly predictive of what the orientation of the next frame is going to be. So these priors are going to be strong. At the same time, because the evidence in each frame about the orientation is very weak, the likelihood is very wide and very uninformative. Task B, on the other hand, is the other way around. Even if you've seen a couple of minus 45-degree frames, that's not very predictive of what the orientation of the next frame is going to be, right? The prior is very weak. At the same time, the likelihood is very strong because no matter what your expectation is, once you see the frame, you'll know the orientation. Okay. Now, importantly, the total information here is the same. And so, but what's important here is that this total information between the evidence and the choice is split into two kinds of separate information by virtue of the fact, just expressing the anatomical fact, that whatever decision-making area in the brain doesn't have access to the observed stimulus on the retina, but has to make all its inferences or updates its beliefs based on intermediate representations, okay? So we call this information category information, this we call sensory information. I'm not married to these terms at all, but they're well defined mathematically. And they span now a two-dimensional task space. Where different tasks lie in different parts of the space. Task A would lie up here with low sensory information, high category information. Task B would lie down here, high sensory, low category information. Importantly, the only thing the ideal observer cares about is a P of C given S, like the total information between stimulus and choice. And it'd be, that determines its performance. Perfect up here, chance down here, threshold, at some intermediate line. Now, what we have shown, and that's the large part of the math I'm going to show you, is that if you now don't perform inference in this model, in this context, using exact inference, like an ideal observer, but approximate inference, you expect or you predict a primacy effect, an overweighting of early stimuli for task A, but not for task B. Okay, and that prediction, we've done both numerical simulations and analytical calculations, holds whether you perform this inference using sampling, MC-MC sampling, or whether you do that by variation inference. Both classic ways of performing inference in a hierarchical generative model or hierarchical probabilistic model for machine learning and statistics, and both have been proposed as good models for how the brain may be doing it. But it doesn't matter. I mean, we were actually hoping to find different predictions, but they both make the same prediction: primacy effect here and ideal weighting or recency effect down here. So we went then to the literature and looked at existing studies. It turned out they nicely fell into two categories with exactly lining up with the predictions that we made. These are 5 classic studies, but we have more in the paper. But these studies, they differ by model system, like monkeys, mice, rats, humans, auditory tasks, visual tasks, motion, disparity, orientation. And so what we wanted to do is test this prediction using the very same observers, the very same task. And so we took human observers, the only thing that we have in the lab in terms of our experimental technology, did an orientation discrimination task, 10 frames, 83 milliseconds each, starting with a easy stimulus up here where both kinds of information are high. That's the actual stimulus we use, like bandpass filtered noise, not these lines. And then we run a staircase, either a staircase reducing the sensor information until you get to threshold performance, you get nice psychometric curves. Or running a staircase, reducing category information until you get the same level of performance. You get another nice set of psychometric curves. These are all individual observers. But when we now perform reverse correlation or logistic regression and compute the weighting profiles, we find clear primacy effects for most of the observers in A, and more flat weighting or recency effects for the very same observers in task context B. And importantly, the slope for each of these observers changed in the predicted direction from more negative to more positive, and individually significant for most of the observers. The same model also predicts that in this task context, observers should be overconfident, while in this task context, their confidence level should be calibrated or slightly underconfident if they have a recency bias. Something that we confirmed in another set of experiments with another 10 subjects, and asking them to do a dual report task for both the orientation and their confidence level. So the very same observers at the same level of confidence were more confident in this task context than in this. And we've also repeated this with dozens of subjects now over a wide range of stimulus values. So this is a really robust phenomenon. Now, importantly, so far, this is all really a computational and algorithmic level model that describes behavior really well in our hands. But in order to test whether this is actually how the brain is doing it, under the hood, we need to, make neural predictions that then can be tested in animal experiments. And it turns out that there is a certain structure in the correlated variability of neurons. Neurons are all variable. This variability tends to be correlated, weakly correlated, but with particular ways. And it turns out that these feedback connections leave a particular signature, particular structure in those noise correlations that I'll show you later in a moment. They should be strong in this case and weak in this case. So, and that's what I'm going to tell you next. So, the way we did that was not by comparing the condition where we expect these correlations to where we don't expect these correlations, but to test the signature, whether they are there in the condition where we expect them for different kinds of tasks. And so the way this works is, right, the nature of these feedback signals depends on the stimuli that we use in a particular task. And the reason for that is that these axes here, they're all vectors. They all represent lots of neurons, individual, they represent individual latent variables. Let's say in the case of V1, there may be the intensity or absence or presence of little Gabor-shaped features in the image. And so if, for instance, the first stimulus contains evidence for a vertical grading, then this will increase the prior probability of the of a neuron representing a latent variable representing a, let's say, a vertical Gabor-shaped feature in the image, or other variables with Gabor-shaped features with orientations that are closely aligned. On the other hand, it'll decrease the prior probability of a Gabor-shaped feature being active with a horizontal orientation, because over the course of task learning, the observer has learned that it's either a vertical or horizontal grading, and that gives rise to a particular structure. Now, we will measure this structure using a pure noise stimulus, a noise stimulus that contains no orientation power in any particular direction, and that's very, very much like Doris South, experiments on mental imagery, or Christina Krug's on showing zero signal stimuli and then looking at the, in order to isolate the effect of feedback, or to isolate the effect of non-stimulus driven signals on these neurons. So if we are in an oblique orientation discrimination task context, the correlation structure that's predicted, here we show the matrix of the correlation structure with neurons sorted by preferred orientation, has peaks at the characteristic tasks and troughs for neurons that correspond to opposite tasks, reflecting exactly this increase in prior and decrease in prior, depending on what is seen before. And if you now change the task, this structure should shift. So now the peaks and troughs are aligned with the new task orientations. And so this prediction was tested in the lab by Bruce Cumming, Adrian Bondi, the grad student, who trained their 2 monkeys on multiple, not just those 2 tasks, with different discrimination boundaries, and then aligned all their recordings to match the task-relevant orientations. And after doing that, you clearly see the predicted structure of these 2 peaks along the diagonal and the troughs along the off-diagonals. Okay. Now, right, keep in mind, the stimulus in all of these cases is exactly the same. It's basically 0 signal, there's no orientation there. So this is entirely due to internally generated activity and predicted. These are predictions from hierarchical probabilistic inference. Now, what's curious about this structure is that this structure is exactly the kind of structure that limits the information in sensory populations. So there's been a lot of work on studying the influence of noise correlations, of correlated variability on the ability of a neural population to carry information about the stimulus. And some correlations are helpful, they're synergistic, some correlations are bad or harmful, and these are exactly the correlations that are harmful. But at the same time, they must somehow emerge as the result of learning, right? They are task specific, so it's hard to see how they could be there before you even do the task. And in fact, with grad student Richard Lang and I, we basically showed that for a Bayesian learner, these correlations are predicted to become stronger over the course of task learning. And something I should have mentioned is that these information limiting correlations, the reason they're information limiting is because they represent or they indicate that there's a lot of redundancy in the information carried by those neurons. So these neurons share a lot of the information. Now, I don't know, maybe you don't find it maybe that surprisingly anymore after the presentation so far, right? So what's happening during hierarchical inference, the information is redistributed, right, from the individual neurons, from the entire population at an earlier time step to every individual neuron at a later time step. But from a classic encoding, decoding, feed-forward framework, that's highly surprising, right? So why would, over the course of learning, your correlations become worse, more harmful, your representation more redundant, right? That also directly contradicts at least simplistic interpretations of the efficient coding, redundancy, reduction hypothesis, etc., that have been very influential in systems neuroscience. At best, even if you invoke feedback connections in a classic feed-forward framework, you would expect that this redundancy should decrease, that somehow if these feedback connections, if attention could somehow manipulate these noise correlations, as it has been suggested by many papers and how data has been interpreted, then you'd expect this, if anything, they should reduce the redundancy and increase the efficiency of the code. So we set out to test that in collaboration with the lab of Adam Snyder, with the monkey neurophysiology lab, training 2 monkeys on 2 tasks, cardinal, oblique each, while recording from Utah arrays in area V4. And here's an example from the first epoch of these 4 epochs, and we see how task performance increases, and then it drops after we prematurely introduce the next task, and then it recovers. And at the same time, the redundancy in the code, it starts at really close to 0, so really highly efficient at the beginning of training, and then the redundancy increases over the course of learning. And so the way we quantify this by regressing the task comprehension against redundancy, and we find really high correlation that's highly significant. And that's not an outlier, it's representative of all 4 epochs. In all 4 epochs, we find a strong correlation between task performance and the redundancy of the code. Now, another prediction of the model is that this redundancy shouldn't just increase over the course of learning, it should also increase over the course of a single trial, like within the trial. And so that's exactly what we tested. And in 3 out of 4 epochs, we find an increase in redundancy over the course of a single trial after learning. So all these solid curves are after learning, while not before. The dashed lines are before learning, when there is no such redistribution expected. We think we can explain this flat or decrease even by the idiosyncratic strategy of the monkey during that task, but that clearly is not what we predicted. So to summarize, we made model predictions from this generative inference framework, making 3 key assumptions. One is that inference is hierarchical, so decision-making areas base their decisions on intermediate representations, not on the observation directly, like all other ideal observer analyses. That posteriors are represented at all the levels, at intermediate levels in particular, and that inference is approximate. And we tested them by manipulating the strength of the prior, by manipulating the temporal coherence of the stimulus, and correctly predicted the strength of the confirmation bias and of confidence judgments. If you're interested in confirmation bias, right, this is all about how our prior expectations bias or influence our subsequent interpretation of the incoming evidence. We've since extended this work also to study the bias that occurs when we have to seek new information, right? Confirmation bias can also occur by being biased in the way we collect new information, through eye movements, for instance. Okay, I'll tell you more about that. That's all psychophysics. And then we manipulate the strength and the prior structure by using different stimuli, like cardinal task, oblique task, to predict the task structure. And then, as predicted by the model, in the neural data, the redundancy of the neural representations increases over learning and increases within the context, on the time scale of a single trial. Something that's, I think poses a real challenge for the classic feed-forward encoding, decoding interpretation of sensory activity. And I should add that, right? So this isn't just a purely confirmatory research program, right? So each of these predictions or each of these data sets we've thought hard about to what degree they can be made compatible with alternative explanations, and but they're challenged. Okay, finally I want to thank the people who actually did most of the work, graduate students Sam, Anton, Cesao, and then former graduate students Richard, Ankani, Marty, and Sharon, as well as my funding sources and particular my experimental collaborators who agreed to train monkeys on these tasks and done all the hard work of collecting data from them.
Great. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Ralph, thank you for the thoughtful talk. So trying to put this in the context of generative models versus discriminative models, my understanding is that from a theoretical point of view, when we talk about a discriminative model, it's as if we are calculating what are the probabilities of, let's say, that signal is a zebra given the signal. But in a generative model, we do the opposite. It's basically, if this is a zebra, what is the probability of this observation, this signal on the retina? So one of them is likelihood, one of them is prior, right? Because if you have a generative model, you are not trying to read out the probability distribution function from the sensory stimulus. Exactly. It's the opposite. So what is in your mind? What is the ultimate experiment, falsifiable experiment that you could stick an electrode in there? What should we measure to falsify one model against the other?
I don't agree with the premise of your question, right? So the generative inference, so we had lots of discussions as part of this collaborations about, the term generative is used in multiple ways, right? Generating a stimulus, the context of a autoencoder, the way, and I don't want to do philosophy, right? So the way I operationalize it is computing a posterior at every level. And the key thing is posterior, right? So the posterior combines the likelihood with the prior, okay? And so while in discriminative inference, you only compute a posterior at the top level. And these are two models that can be distinguished based on data. And I tried to convince you that some of this data, provides evidence in favor of the model on the right, but not on the left.
And that's true, but physiologically, when I stick my electrode into, let's say, face cells in IT cortex, what should be the experiment to separate these two?
Yeah,
in terms of the neural response?
So I think the short answer is that in order to distinguish between those two, you shouldn't stick your electrodes at anywhere near the top level. You should stick it somewhere at the lower level, because that's where those two models are different. Both of these models can compute the same posterior over your top level variables. And so two systems implementing these two models can't really distinguish between them. Now, look, the real brain is of course much more complicated than this, right? So even the top level has structure. So there, these are not 3 levels of latent variables. There's a whole network of latent variables of which the different phase patches, represent probably different latent variables. So by studying, let's say, whether they are, changing their representation of whatever they believe in a coordinated fashion versus non-coordinated fashion, for instance, that's one way how you might get at that question. But by just thinking about the top layer, you cannot. Yeah.
Thank you.
John?
Ralph, beautiful talk. I am one of the people guilty of thinking about these things as changes in correlation as reflecting attentional processes. So I just wanted to get your thoughts, because the talk is so compelling, and the recency effects, the primacy effects, and so forth. So when we record from area V4 and the monkey deploys attention to the stimulus, we see very profound reductions in correlated variability, but they are limited to being below a certain frequency range, like 5 hertz and below, let's say. When we optogenetically stimulate V4, in the case where the monkey's making an orientation discrimination task with a stimulus that just sits there for a couple 100 milliseconds, and they're discriminating very fine orientation differences, we see that the imposition of that low frequency correlation that is suppressed by attention impairs orientation discrimination. But if we impose equally strong high-frequency correlations that attention does not bother to suppress, there's no effect on discrimination. And so I guess I'm reaching out to see if there's a way that you have in your mind of reconciling these two different patterns, and also wondering whether it might have something to do with time scale, because what we see is all on the time scale of a fixation between eye movements, let's say.
Yes, so different levels. I mean, to really give a good answer, I'd have to know a bit more about the paradigm.
Sorry.
There is a, there's a number of experiments and empirical studies, high-profile studies that show, okay, under attention, correlations decrease. Yeah. Now, correlations typically means average noise correlations, right? And average noise correlations actually have very little influence on the information that's being represented by the population. They may still have an influence on the performance of the animal if you assume maybe a suboptimal readout or something like this. But I think this is something to tell about. Many of these studies were also done in the context of change detection tasks, where much of the neural response is really due to release from adaptation. Which is kind of outside any of the models, and I think it's really outside our thinking too. But it's, I think, the elephant in the room that I think really biases these experiments. If you go back, if you consider discrimination tasks where you don't have that problem, we find these data, and there's an early study, Cohn and Newsome, 2008, they also found change in noise correlations in line with these results.
Yes.
So I think what you find in a specific experiment may depend on such things that aren't maybe often appreciated or acknowledged. And so
Yeah,
reluctant.
maybe we can just talk off.
Yeah, I'd be very happy
Thank
to talk
you.
more about.
Sorry for the complex question.
Yeah, no. But there is another interesting question here, and that is, what is attention, right? I mean, intuitively, there seems to be something like attention. And I personally think there is a room for attention here. So what would be attention be in the context of a hierarchical inference framework? For an ideal observer, attention doesn't make sense because the ideal observer is already perfect. So at best, you could maybe think about, tuning the sensor to get slightly better observations, but not on the intermediate level. But as soon as you go to approximate inference, you can come up with a theory for attention that may, bias the approximation in the direction that maximizes performance for the task. In the context of machine learning, this is sometimes called loss-calibrated approximations. And anyway, I'm a theoretical direction that I'm also happy to talk about. But
I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
All right, let's thank Ralph again.